In the process theology view, God, or I am, is fully present with us and journeys along with creation into the future. God attempts to guide that trajectory into the future towards God's intention of goodness. The God of process theology does not, and in fact cannot, coerce. Rather, God leads and guides, lures, as process theologians like to say, creation towards the best possible future. But creation, and particularly complex life forms such as humans, can choose to cooperate or not with God's intentions. Thus, process theology places a premium on free will, while also acknowledging that the choices we are able to make are constrained by many factors, including the past that we are building upon. For the Christian, Jesus Christ can be seen as having embodied God's intention, God's logos, the Word made flesh, towards humanity and creation, and as having been utterly faithful in choosing to cooperate at each moment with God's will. In doing so, Jesus modeled not only the character and intentions of God, but also what it looks like to listen to and to obey God. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. The persuasive rather than coercive interaction of God with creation points to another tenet of process theology, which is that God is utterly relational to creation. God experiences everything that creation experiences, and God is affected by it. God feels what we feel. God suffers with us when we suffer. And not just us humans, but monkeys and mollusks and maple trees too. This is radically different from classical theology's view of God as the immutable, unmoved mover. It also works against the idea of God's creation as being a hierarchy with humankind at the top. Rather, creation, the universe, is an interdependent system, an unfolding process, and each part and particle is important to God and is connected to God. There's no reason to believe that humans are the pinnacle of God's creation. Perhaps we have a long way to go in our continuing God-guided evolution, growing, if we choose to, closer and closer to God's vision of what we can become. And perhaps there are beings on other planets, in other galaxies, that are equally objects of God's love and goodness. Perhaps some are farther along than us in the process of growing into God. The implication of this aspect of process theology is that each of us has the opportunity and the responsibility to listen to God's leading and to make choices in cooperation with God's desires. And our free will choices have significance. As Moses said to the gathered Hebrews, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life. Or as God spoke through Jeremiah, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. Or as James wrote to the early Christians, Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. Or again, Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. In fact, the entire letter of James, which, by the way, Martin Luther didn't much care for because it conflicted with his theology, but the entire letter of James is a real eye-opener when read from a process theology perspective. It's all about choices. Quakers speak of the inward light, which is God leading, guiding, teaching, correcting, inspiring, and transforming us from within if we yield and open ourselves to it. At the very heart of Quakerism is the belief that God is at work within every person. Hence the common saying among friends, going back to George Fox, that there is that of God in everyone. And that we can choose to respond to God, not just once at the point of conversion, but continually. I began by quoting the statistician Box's axiom that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I would like to finish by pointing out one more area in which process theology is particularly useful. This is in regards to theodicy. Theodicy is the name given to the problem of justifying how a good God can allow evil and suffering to occur. Is evil and suffering part of God's plan? If God is all-powerful, why can't God prevent suffering and evil? Classical theology has been unable to satisfactorily answer questions like this. If a person had the ability to save someone, a child perhaps, from terrible harm, but stood by and did nothing, we would consider that person irresponsible at best and evil at worst. What about God? Process theology eliminates essentially this problem by positing that since God's power, based in love, is persuasive and interactive rather than coercive and unilateral, God actually cannot prevent evil and suffering, except through us. We are God's hands. This turns the question of theodicy into a question of anthropodicy. Why do we allow evil and suffering to occur? Process theology defines the term omnipotence in a different way. God's power is demonstrated relationally rather than unilaterally. Unlike its close evangelical cousin, open theism, process theology does not view God as having unilateral power, but as having chosen not to use it within creation. Rather, process theology posits that as a non-corporeal yet utterly relational being who experiences time along with us, God's power is in fully sharing the experiences of all of creation, being affected by those experiences, and creatively adjusting and guiding towards a redemptive future. This is the process within which God works. God's omnipotence does not mean all-controlling, as Calvin interpreted it. Rather, God's nature and character is love, and so God's power is persuasive and relational. We might even say seductive. We might say that God woos rather than wills. It is the power of love rather than force. The practical implications of process theology are profound. It means that our lives matter in God's plan for the universe, while at the same time deflating the hubris of seeing ourselves as the pinnacle of God's creation. It means that prayer matters, particularly prayer in which we listen for God's leadings. It means that being a Christian is an active process rather than a transactional event. It means that worship is not about appeasement, but about opening ourselves to God and to others, which means that discipleship and outreach flow naturally from worship. It means that Christ really was the revelation of God, modeling God's character, God's relationality, God's identification with us, God's inclusiveness, and God's redemptive intent. Christ demonstrated a power that was relational rather than, and contrary to expectations, unilateral. Christ demonstrated a power that was not unilateral, but was relational. Process theologian Tripp Fuller describes this as a cruciform omnipotence. It means that there is something to the depiction of God in the Hebrew Scriptures as a reactive and relational being, albeit filtered through an ancient pre-scientific tribal culture living in a world of violence and uncertainty. It means that we know that in everything God works for good with those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose, Romans 8:28. It means that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free, Galatians 5:1. It means that there is always hope, even when things seem darkest, and always purpose, for God is with us. It means that life is an adventure, and that the loving Creator of the universe shares the adventure with us.